if the DRKs are any faster than the sheetrock screws, but they do seem to last a little bit longer, and sometimes not slip as much. But every time they make one of these advances, the fastener tends to be more expensive also, so it's a little pricier to build a boat with each one of these advancements. Before using sheetrock screws or something like that, a lot of times things would just be nailed together. And the nails that they would use would be just a common nail. If you really wanted it to hold, galvanized would be used. Galvanizing holds like crazy. But taking things apart is pretty problematic once you've got something like that, because you end up doing a good deal of damage to whatever piece of wood it's nailed into on that. I've added this little, this is a ring shank nail, and I added this one because we use this in the lofting process to take patterns off of. The thing that's nice about this is actually the head of the nail, not necessarily the rest of it right there. Because if you're putting this down on a surface, putting a series of nails like you did on your molds and then putting the mold down and tapping it down, it leaves a really nice mark on your mold that you can go back and get back inside there. Just regular finish nails that we use, again, in the lofting process. Just put points down so we can run battens across there. And those come, you know, again, in all sorts of different types of metals and coatings, but we just use just regular steel ones for the most part. You can get galvanized ones, which will probably last a little bit longer, but same thing, once you've driven a galvanized nail in, it takes quite a bit more, and they can take up some of the surface because they do grip so well for that. Some of the other things that we might use too is for the heavier molds or for the strong backs would be some kind of a bolt. It's just, you know, something that's got a head on it and threads on it, so you can use washers and nuts to hold things together. If you need a good amount of power, holding power with something that might get wrapped or something like that, it's a good idea to use a bolt instead of screws, because they basically sandwich two pieces together and squeeze them together and do a really nice job of, you know, maintaining a solid structure. And that's basically what we use for most of the strong backs, is a couple of bolts on the legs, which are the parts that get the most stress on them when they're leaned against or racked. Okay, as far as fastenings in bolts themselves, again, you know, a good variety. So going down, the ones that we probably use the most in this, you know, around here are just regular wood screws. Again, in a variety of metals. We primarily use silicon bronze. Silicon bronze works really well in a saltwater environment, but you can use, you know, other materials. Brass is sometimes used in freshwater boats, but brass is relatively weak, so you have to be careful with that whenever you're using it. You can use iron. They used to use a lot of iron, and that'll hold up for maybe, I guess, depending on the environment, it seems like maybe 20 years or so, and then you can actually start seeing signs of rust, because iron will rust in a saltwater environment. The one bad thing about iron too is that as it rusts, it actually expands, and that expansion can create some problems in terms of, you know, cracking and things like that in pieces of wood. The other thing that it'll do too is react with the wood around it and really deteriorate the wood around the fastener itself. So you have to be careful with that. But a lot of older boats, you know, early 1900s, 20s or something like that, were done in iron. The ones that have lasted generally have had those iron fasteners taken out and have been replaced with something that's not quite as corrosive as that. But it was, you know, it was very widely used. Iron was also used for clinch nails. And clinch nails are basically a nail. This is a clinch nail here. This one's copper, it's not iron. But they're shaped in such a way that you drive it through the two pieces that you're trying to hold together, and then you fold over the top of it. That's why they're called clinch nails, because you clinch them over, and that whole thing's together. They actually work quite well. They work pretty well for really lightweight boats too, because they are, you know, a pretty small fastener. And it's a very quick way of putting boats together. We actually used to use clinch nails to fasten the planks on the Susan skiffs. We're now using rivets, and one of the main reasons is because it's really hard to get clinch nails these days. There were only a couple of manufacturers several years ago, and one of them was Strawberry Bank down in New Hampshire. It's a museum down there. They have a machine that will make those nails, but they only had one or two people that knew how to run the machine, so if you ordered it, you had to order it well in advance, and it would take quite a while. And they've gotten to the point now where they're very expensive because they don't mass produce them anymore. They just do small quantities, and it gets expensive that way. They used to do iron clinch nails too for a lot of work boats. Again, it's a really fast way of putting things together. Now they've gone basically to either rivets or, you know, standard fastenings for those. The other galvanized piece that I've got is this iron. This is basically an iron spike, but in boat building terms, I usually call it a boat nail. A lot of the big schooners that you see around here are actually fastened with nails that are similar to that. And again, being galvanized, they hold really well. And the galvanizing is basically one step up from iron. The galvanizing, which is basically like a zinc coating on it, helps prevent some of that decay and some of the rust in the nail itself. Okay, bronze. So the screw is probably the one that we use the most, and bronze is used a lot in saltwater environments because of its corrosive resistance. But bronze is also, you can also get what are called lag bolts, which are just these giant bolts like this, which will hold things together also. Just a straight bolt wherever you can. You know, bolting and sandwiching things is generally stronger than just a lag bolt because you're not relying on just the threads to hold things together. You've got something that goes through everything and just brings everything together. One of the nice things about bronze is that it's relatively easy to work, so you can make your own bolts, which saves you a ton of money because these made up in longer lengths are very, very expensive. And especially on boats like the Cliffy Lobster boat downstairs uses a lot of bronze, and if you can just buy the rod and do your own threading, you end up saving quite a bit.
Do we have the capability to do that here? Can we thread here?
Yeah.
Do you have a machine or is it by hand?
By hand, yeah. You actually have the lathe. Probably, you could, you know, set that up for doing it, but we don't have a dedicated threading machine.
What do you use to do it by hand? What do you use to do it by hand?
It's a tap set. So we can show you downstairs. We probably should have a bolt making demo at some point or another. But it's a tool that goes into a handle, and it just, you know, threads.
The die is used for external threads.
Looks like a nut with the threads of it are cutters. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's see, other types of metals that are used sometimes. are stainless steel, and that's a good strong fastener too. Sometimes not as reliably corrosive resistant as bronze is. There are different types of stainless steels, which is an alloy, and some of them are a little bit more corrosive resistant than others. Let's see, what else have we got going here? All right, so that's silicon bronze for most of the screws. A lot of these down in here are copper, or a combination of copper and bronze also. We've talked a little bit about the clinch nail itself. They come in all sorts of different sizes. We've got some slightly bigger ones, but you can get them, even, bigger than that. Same thing, you can actually see how these are cut. Where they've got a flat surface there, which is meant to be the surface that's actually rounded over.
Is there a special tool for those, for doing the
Clinching.
clinch?
For clinching,
And is there a different size tool for each size nail?
there's generally not different sizes, although you probably use a bigger one than, on something like that. There are special tools. The ones that we generally use are just auto body tools, backers, big heavy tools. They've got a little bit of rocker to it, because the motion is, as you're driving it through, you actually rock it.
Right.
And the idea is to actually, because sometimes you see these and they're just folded over.
Right.
But you actually want to try to curl them back on themselves and back into the wood itself too. So clinch nails, there's copper tacks, and they might be used in something that's very light, like canoe building or something like that. Copper tacks you can clench also. You can, kind of curl over and clench back on themselves too. But they're made slightly different than a clinch nail is. This is called a ring shank nail, and you can see that it's got these little rings on it. These actually grip very well, to the point where once you've driven it in there, you better be ready to leave it in there, because again, trying to rip it out, you can do quite a bit of damage to whatever it's holding on to, or just rip the head off of it, because it's relatively soft, sometimes hard to get out. And they come in a variety of sizes too. We've got a couple, but they come in sizes that are much bigger than this too. So sometimes they're used for, holding planks and things like that together. And then, last but not least, are rivets, which again come in a variety of sizes. And they initially started out with iron rivets, and those, if they're made well, actually work quite well. A lot of the early Norwegian boats were built, and some still are built with iron fasteners and iron rivets. But what they're calling iron these days just doesn't hold up, as well as high-grade iron that you used to be able to get. And there are, a variety of sizes of these too. They do a really nice job of holding things together. The one thing with rivets that you can't really do with is rely on them to draw things together. They will draw things together a little bit, but the idea with the rivet is basically get everything clamped into place where you want it, and use the rivet to hold it into place instead of trying to draw it together. Ideally, that's the same with any kind of fastener, screws or anything like that. But you can get away with a little bit more with a screw fastener, because it will actually draw something together and draw something in. So the screw was developed basically as a way of being able to work a lot faster, and not having to go directly through like a frame or something like that in order to fasten it. But it did make building boats quicker and kind of on a production basis a lot easier. because you didn't have to go through as many steps. And they did hold, you know, things together well, and you can actually take them out without damaging things quite as much as you would if you had a nail or something like that you had to bang into like that. The rivets that we use here, we basically use a common copper nail, and then this little guy, which is either referred to as a burr or a rove, I think depending on your geographic location.
Ferrule.
What's that?
Little ferrule.
Ferrule?
Oh, the flat
Will-
thing,
Will
washer,
Um,
little washer looking thing, it's
Yeah.
called a burl,
A burr,
Roll.
a burr.
or, yeah, B-U-R-R, or a rove,
Okay.
R-O-V-E.
That's
Those are two things that are used to
The
call.
ferrule you're referring to, F-U-R-R-E-L? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a ferrule.
So that's what we use basically around here. That seems to be more of a North American thing. In Europe, they use a lot of these, what some people refer to as Norwegian style rivets, which are actually square instead of round. And the rove itself is got a little, it's a little dome as opposed to just a, you know, flat washer type like that.
And so what's the functional difference between those two?
I mean, these here, it's basically like, you know, square peg in a round hole, so it holds, you know, really well when you're doing it, when you're setting it back inside there.
Is the dome, is it concave side towards the wood or away from the wood?
It's domed up,
Okay.
away from the wood.
They give it better holding power, like clamping.
Does it flatten out after you pound it? Does the roll flatten a little bit, or does it stay?
It
like
might
that?
flatten a little bit, but no, it doesn't flatten out. No,
Yeah.
you'd be pounding it way too hard if you're
Right.
beating it that hard
Wow.
on those.
Makes for a surface that's a fair to sand.
Sure.
Yeah,
Compared to sand, yeah.
little bumps everywhere. On that. Let's see. Oh, let's see.
How do you choose? Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead, Joel?
Sure. Is there, aside from the head, the shape of the head, is there a difference between, in the screws, between the GRK and the sheetrock screws?
They're threaded differently. I mean, they're both meant to be driven, you know, without having to do, you know, like pre-drilling and things like that.
Is there something about the GRK that makes them faster to screw in?
No, not
Not harder.
necessarily.
Not a harder steel.
It's not a Phillips head?
Steel-wise, they're technically structural, like a true GRK is structural.
Okay.
A sheetrock screw is a non-structural screw. So
Holding
But
the
back.
actual alloy makeup.
The head on it itself doesn't strip quite as easily.
Yeah.
Or the ones from Home Depot.
Yeah, yeah.
I've had a
like
lot of heads.
Deckmates or any of that stuff. Those are, and they're all labeled if you look at the box, non-structural.
Right.
Oh, that,
You guys will snap.
But they're like, yeah, those boxes that are
yeah, we had a
$20.
bunch of heads snap off of the.
What kind?
Of the GRKs?
Yeah, like, just random boxes from Home Depot, like, over the years. All of a sudden you get a box, and we thought it was more just box, like the pendant, versus like the overall brand, because we'd use them, and then all of a sudden we get a box where it's like heads snapping all the time, so I feel like you would just get like a bad batch of
Yeah.
metal.
With the GRK brand, I mean, they're all, like, when they're labeled structural versus non-structural, then there's a whole different set of specifications that they have to meet. So the non-structural stuff, and like a lot of, like, kind of because there's so many knockoff brands
Yeah.
that none of those are, or not none of them, but most of them are non-structural, and you'll run into a lot of those issues with them versus like the like GRK branding.
So they're just like, the only difference is that we use the star bit and to make it like it's marketing, right?
Yeah, well, the Phillips Drive was pre, any sort of like, it's basically like a self torque rating for this screw.
Mm.
So like you hit a certain point and the foot-pounds of torque that you have to put in to the screw head, it allows it to slip. So it's like, so you don't have to think about the torque setting or have a torque setting on it, like a drill or something. I'm not explaining this well, I'm sorry. But that's what a Phillips head is designed for versus like a flat blade.
That it's less likely to strip.
Yeah, you can put a lot more force into
Yep.
a flat head than you can into a Phillips, and a Phillips will a Phillips is intentionally designed to slip.
Oh, okay.
Intentionally designed to what?
Slip.
Intentionally designed to slip
Oh,
at a
yeah.
Because that's
certain
what-
amount of foot-pounds.
Yeah,
Right,
whether it's
right.
like that rather than like that.
Yeah,
Is the GRK like that too, or not?
no, they're not like that.
Oh, keep going.
The
Drive right through.
GRK has straight sides and Phillips has like that.
Another type of metal or a fastener that you rarely find these days is called Manel. And it's material with a pretty high nickel content, so it's very expensive. And that's why you don't find it very much anymore. They used to use it more. They still use it in some fabrications and everything. And in terms of corrosion resistance, you can't really do much better than Manel.
Is that more expensive than stainless steel even?
Way, yeah. Silicon bronze is more expensive than stainless steel.
Yeah.
So between silicon bronze and nickel, nickel is the better of the two in terms of corrosion resistance?
No, that's Manel, which again is another alloy, but it does have a pretty high degree of
Oh,
control.
okay.
That's, what makes it
Huh.
both expensive and pretty corrosion resistant.
So the lag bolts, these are still wood screws, you're not putting a,
Right,
Right.
That's a lag bolt, but it doesn't have a bolt on it.
So Nina was about to ask, how do you decide what fastener to use where, right?
Yeah, or also how big of a fastener to use, and what are you thinking about when you're selecting a fastener?
Good question.
Yeah, experience.
In terms of which type of fastener that you use, I think the application is pretty important. Generally, if you're putting together something that's really quite thin, and you've got thin planking, you probably want to try to avoid, something that's gonna take a good chunk of the wood out. And especially if you've got very small frames and you don't have much to bite into, then a screw's not gonna work that well, because it's relying on the threads in the material to hold it. So then something like a clinch nail or a rivet or something would work, quite a bit better for that. Occasionally, it's personal preference. Some people swear by rivets, even on big boats. They'd rather rivet through the frame than use a screw, because they just feel that that's a cleaner way to do it, and feel a little bit more comfortable about the holding power. I don't know if anybody's ever done any tests on holding power, screws as opposed to like a copper rivet.
what does the Dublin Bay use to fasten the planking?
Screws.
Screws?
Well, most boats built these days are screw fastened, as opposed to riveted. You're adding a good bit of time, because of all the different steps you have
Yeah.
to take in riveting. Especially on a big boat, it's also a two-man operation, because there's gotta be one person inside, one person outside.
And the larger the vessel, the bigger the rivets get.
Yeah.
And the more time you gotta spend peening them, so you spend, a
One
couple of
person can put a
weeks
screw in.
peening
Yeah.
16-penny rivets, and you kinda wanna hate your elbows.
Yeah, that's when you get into the air guns. And you can use those, if you're doing bigger boats to get back in there and beam stuff over. We built a 34-foot Friendship sloop that was all copper riveted. And that took quite a bit of time. And they spent, I think, maybe a day or a day and a half doing it by hand, and then cranked out, the air gun to could do it.
And is that because that's the specifications that the person who commissioned it wanted? They wanted rivets, or, it didn't make sense to use screws in that?
No, could use screws, yeah, they just wanted rivets instead
Okay.
of, could use the screws.
Is one or the other preferable from like a 30 years from now we're doing maintenance perspective? A rivet versus a screw, I mean?
A rivet will last forever,
Yeah. I like rivets.
yeah.
I'm one of those people on the rivet train.
Yeah, and if you're doing anything like laminated frame, you know, a rivet will hold those frames together. If you're doing split frames, a rivet will hold those together. Where if you're not careful, you know, with a screw, you might actually push, you know, things apart.
Maintenance wise, it's not bad either, because with screws, a lot of times the heads will corrode,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and then you've got nothing to bite onto, so you wind up drilling a pilot hole down the center line of the shaft of the screw and putting a screw extractor in there.
Yep.
Or if you're lucky, you find a set of left-hand twist bits, and you can hopefully wind up out with a set of left-hand twist bits. But you gotta get that screw out of there somehow. And after you've removed all the bungs to get a rivet out, you would have to disassemble the entire interior of the vessel to get to all of the rivets. But if all that stuff's happening anyway, you just grind the head off and then take a center punch and shoot the rivet right out.
Yeah.
So rivets you can get out a lot more cleanly, provided you have the space to work on the interior of the vessel. Screws are a pain in the butt to get out, but you also don't have to take apart the entire interior of the vessel. So it's kind of a
Yeah.
little bit of a trade-off, what you're actually doing with it.
So when you're saying the interior of the vessel, like, you're talking about in the case of like the Dublin Bay, you have to get through all the marine plywood stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be able to have cabinetry and all that other stuff in there. You'd have to, you know, you think two rivets per plank
Yeah.
through the frame, and each frame, you've got like, I don't know, this load of frames and everything, and you gotta get to every single one of those to get them off.
So as far as maintenance go, if your only concern is how am I going to maintain this later, rivets are easier on a boat that doesn't have all the fancy stuff on the inside.
Well, rivets you don't ever have to replace, cause they'll last forever.
Right.
But if you stove in a plank or something, say you
Yeah.
hit the rocks and you got, you're broken through the planks, and you need to access enough rivets to work back the scarf and
Yep.
so,
Okay.
you know, or you, steel starts falling off.
Are they ever attached with nuts and bolts? Nice.
Say that again?
Did they ever use nuts and bolts on a plank, or?
Yeah, yeah, they do. On some of the bigger boats, especially down below the water line, sometimes they'll use those. I think either Chris Craft or some of those, occasionally they would use, you know, very small, like a machine nut or something like that, a machine bolt.
So what is the rivet last longer than
Why does it last
the
longer?
screw? You said rivets last forever.
Yeah, they do. Good question. I think it's because, you know, with any kind of stress or anything like that, you're not really, with a rivet, you're not really working that, you know, the thread to wood connection, at all.
Swelling of the wood would cause loosening and moisture getting in there after time, maybe.
I guess there's a lot more surface area of the screw
Yeah,
to,
Yeah, and very
Start
thin
corroding.
surface area which can corrode, you know, quite easily.
Yeah, you think of the threads, that the edges of that thread can, you know, dissipate and corrode really rapidly, and then all you're left with is a nail that's too small for the hole that it's in. Is really what it comes down to, whereas the rivet's captured. And it's also the metal as well, you know, silicon bronze needs to be stronger in order to be, like a screw needs to be stronger in order to be driven in. So you wind up using silicon bronze. Copper does not need to be as strong, it's malleable because it's not being driven in the same way. So you can use a more corrosion resistant metal that is softer than you would be able to use in a screw.
Yeah, the same as the threads on the screw, you know, basically the opposite threads in the wood are quite thin up and around in there, and they can degrade pretty quickly also. Whereas a rivet, you've got, you know, you're captured end to end, not inside.
For all those wood screws, are those all the kind of thing where you would drill a pilot hole before fastening them in?
Yeah, especially with bronze, because if you tried, you know, driving that into a piece of oak, you just snap the head.
Is
And
there a
you'd probably
rule of
crack the
sorry.
oak. What's that?
No, I know, I didn't want to interrupt. No, is that it? Okay, yeah. Do you, so like with that, is there like a rule of thumb for, the pilot hole? Like the pilot hole to screw, like is there like a general, like, you wanna use this, like half of a size, or a quarter size, or 3/4 of a size? Cause I always just eyeball it, and then I'm like, oh, that looks good, like, cool, we'll go with that one. You know, like, but like, is there, like, if you're using a 1/2 inch, should you use a 1/4 inch pilot hole? Kind of thing. Or does it not matter, just make sure it's smaller than whatever it is?
No, I'm sure there is a rule of thumb, and it might depend on the type of metal that you're using with that. We use fuller bits for most of the screws, and I don't know what their formula is, but I would imagine that they're drilling the hole not much bigger than the core of that, you know, just allowing the threads themselves to get right into the wood.
But then on the outer piece towards the head, we're drilling the size of the shank,
Right.
right?
And on the fuller bits, are they matched to the size of the screw?
They are.
Yeah.
So, in other words, so you don't have to make a decision, you just use the fuller bit that's matched to that size screw. Yep. That's the easy way.
What's a fuller bit?
Yeah.
It gets mountain.
Andy, do you wanna go? Yeah.
So when do you, at what point do you start using washers? Like on the bolts, are there, Rick, do you have washers on the inside of the clipping?
On these?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a question I had too.
There's a washer and then the nut goes on.
Yeah. Okay. Alright, so is it always on a bolt? You're always using a washer?
Generally, if you've got a nut going on there, you generally use a washer.
And what's the function that the washer is serving?
Surface area?
Spreads the load.
Okay.
Yeah, because you can hold a sandwiching two things, try to get a little bit out of it.
So it's a tapered bit.
And it,
The threads are a shallower pitch, so you can.
Yeah.
the kind of thing for,
Yeah.
and you can unscrew this and.
So you can put a lot of force on the bolt. And because of
And then you
For the
choose
same
the
idea,
length
like,
of,
you know,
the length according to the length of the diameter. Given for each one.
Okay.
How are rivets,
but like, you know, the GRK,
how are they
because the head's so small,
fastening?
you just run it.
How are they?
So you've got, yeah, basically here's one. So you've got a head on one side, you drill a hole through, you know, plank and frame, pop this in, put the washer on top, clip it, and then you call what's called peening, you peen it over,
Okay.
so it mushrooms the head, and then it, you know, holds those two
Just a
things,
little bit wider.
hold everything together.
Ellery, on the Susan skiff upstairs, you can see in the planking what it looks like, and we
Yeah.
will also do a riveting demo a little closer to when you guys are getting to the stage of riveting things.
Okay. Yeah.
Well,
I've seen
look at
how
the
they
waterways,
work
too.
there
Yeah,
on the boat.
yeah.
The
But I
water
don't
was
know how they,
The magic. You want to know the magic
And this-
secrets.
yeah.
This side is for a certain size screw, certain diameter screw, but you move this back
Kevin,
and
on
forth
the
depending on
clinch
how long the
nails,
screw is.
you pre-drill for those, just like a rivet,
And
is that
this,
right?
Yeah, again, they're, you know, they're soft copper, so they would just bend if you tried to drive them without pre-drill.
Up to here, and the wood, and
Brett, to answer your question a little bit further, there are standards for types of fasteners to use in certain situations, and depending on, you know, how big the material is. And there's a couple charts, Elements of Yacht Design, Hershoff, has got, you know, a table in there. And I think in the boat building manual, Stuart's boat building manual, I think he's got several tables in there about fastener sizes to use.
There's also a really great, Wooden Boat put together these publications that were compilations of different articles that different folks had written. I think Ryan has it right now, but there's a really great book called Planking and Fastening. And they go into like fuller bits and the use of fuller bits and then, like step drilling and, you know, the different orientations of a piece of wood and how you would cause like end grain, you don't need to counter bore the hole as large, or you don't need to pilot drill the hole for a screw as large versus like running through the grain or across the grain. So there's like, there's different size holes that you would drill for types of wood, and also if the wood's green or not really changes it, because green wood's a lot softer generally. So there's a lot of different variants in like what size pilot hole to drill. But there are some very extensive like tables of.
Someone's
Here's
going
all
down
the-
that rabbit hole for me.
Somebody's
That's
wicked hardcore and like done pull tests on everything and da 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 da.
Is that in your pocket, Rick? It's not, oh man.
What's that? Yeah, what's that blue like all knowledge book you have?
Yeah,
The pocket reference book.
Just in his head.
yeah, I was gonna say, yes, yeah, that's this.
That's my hat, dude. Wait, the pocket rep?
Yeah, it has like all the.
That's the everything book?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it's all in there. That covers a lot of stuff though.
Yeah.
There's that.
Not everything.
It does have a really nice chart for drill to tap to die
Yeah.
sizes
Mm.
and all that stuff, but I don't know, it might be, I haven't ever looked for it specifically.
Okay, any more questions on fasteners?
What kind of piece of wood would you drive that boat nail into? It's hard to imagine what wouldn't just destroy if you banged it into it.
2-inch oak into like a 6-inch frame.
But you would
Would you-
pilot drill.
Yeah,
Pilot hole.
yeah,
You drill a-
pilot drill, you'd also
Smaller.
drill a counter bore head usually. And then usually drive it in on the bigger ones. I don't know what those things are called.
Pinball,
Pinball?
yeah.
Yeah. Is that the one that you hold, or is that the one that's just got a pin on the end of it?
That's the one that somebody stands there, holds like this.
Yeah.
Takes a bucket and slides it.
Pound it in there.
That's the countersink it some,
I'm pretty sure we got one.
that's
Yeah,
the
that's
countersink it a little bit. The pinball is to countersink it.
Yeah. Usually you drill, a little bit, or they make up a drill, you know, fabricate a drill with a small
Make a
counter
reed.
bore in it. Yeah.
That's for putting the head right in the end, at the end?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
these are made of a softer steel than an actual maul itself. Because boat nails are galvanized, it's the zinc coating that keeps them from corroding anywhere near as fast. So if you break that zinc off the head, then the head starts to corrode. And then once the head is gone, really, for all intents and purposes, lost your fastener.
By the time you need to
So,
use that, this is already into the wood, so no one has to hold it.
you
Hold it
have a
out.
pilot
No,
hole,
yeah.
and you would set it, but then you
Oh.
have a pin maul.
And
And
Kinda
then you'd
countersink.
have
Somebody's
somebody
holding
standing
that.
there with a 10-pound sledge hitting the top of the pin maul. And you use a pin maul like a nail set. But this is
And that's to protect.
that's to keep, and a lot of people stick, you know, like a little brass end or something soft, a soft metal on the end to help the zinc even more. But it's really the zinc coating on the steel that keeps it going.
So you're swinging like a sledge so that you don't swing this, miss, and put a hole in your boat. Is that,
Yeah, but someone's holding
Yeah.
it.
You'd have a pretty chowder boat, I think, if you tried to do it.
if you were trying to swing this and hit the
I've seen these also with, like a loose fitted, like steel handle on it too. I don't know which would be easier to control, but if you're hanging onto that thing all day with somebody pounding on it, either they take a wrong swing or something like that, I imagine your arms are like,
Yeah.